Welcome back, Life Science learners. In this segment, we're going to focus on the uterine and ovarian cycle. Just a recap of what we've looked at. We've looked at the development within the ovary. We've looked at structures such as the primary follicle, the Grafting follicle, as well as the corpus luteum. We're going to try and spend some time now looking at the details of what happens within the ovary. We're also going to look at the uterine cycle and the events that happen within the uterus. So, when we look at the menstrual cycle, we would see that there are three phases in the menstrual cycle. And these can be called the follicular phase, which is just before ovulation, and hence it's called the pre-ovulatory phase. We have ovulation, which we've just looked at, as well as we see what happens after ovulation, and we call that the post-ovulatory phase or the luteal phase, and this is with reference to the corpus luteum. When we look at the uterine cycle, this is divided into the following phases. So we refer to the process of menstruation. We also refer to the process of the proliferative stage, as well as the last phase of the secretory or the premenstrual phase. So we're going to try and unpack these by looking at each one in detail. So as I mentioned, when we looked at the ovary, we saw that there were several structures that developed from the primary follicle. We saw that maturing into a Grafting follicle, and we saw the process of ovulation. And then we looked at the development of the corpus luteum and how that gradually degenerates towards the end of the cycle. Let's try and understand this in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned, within the ovary, we see that the primary follicle will develop, and this is developing under the influence of the hormone FSH, which we will talk about in detail as we get into the next segment. The primary follicle gradually develops and it matures into a Grafting follicle. Around day 14, guys, a process of ovulation occurs, and that essentially points to the release of an oocyte. And that oocyte then enters the structure called the fallopian tube, and in anticipation of a sperm cell that may potentially be available for fertilization. We do know that the Grafting follicle now, after releasing an egg, becomes the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum gradually degenerates over the next 14 days, and we know that the corpus luteum plays an important secretory function. Right, so when we look at this, we got to understand that these cyclic changes occur as follows. Firstly, the development of the primary follicle into the mature Grafting follicle takes place between day 1 to day 14. And we see that this process here takes around 14 days. So from the primary follicle all the way to the Grafting follicle, that takes a period of 14 days. At the end of the 14 days, or towards the midpoint of the cycle, the rupturing of the follicle and the release of an immature ovum is called ovulation. And this we see as indicated in the diagram here. We know that after the follicle has been released and the oocyte has left the ovary, that Grafting follicle is now called the corpus luteum. You would see the details of ovulation in this image, where the oocyte is released, and now we refer to that Grafting follicle as the corpus luteum. Again, if we try and unpack the word corpus, so it refers to something that's dead, and luteum would refer to a degenerating body or structure. And so this corpus luteum then gradually deteriorates over the next 14 odd days. What's important to recognize is that the events in the ovary starts at the birth of a female baby. At birth, there are around 700,000 to 2 million primary oocytes, and these are cells that are in the ovary of the developing fetus. The primary follicles in a baby girl will then undergo further development as the baby matures into a young girl. The primary oocytes remain in a resting phase up until puberty. At puberty, we see that between the ages of 10 to 12 years, the pituitary gland starts to secrete a hormone called FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. This hormone stimulates the development of the primary follicle into what we call the Grafting follicle. So here you see the primary follicle being stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone to develop into the Grafting follicle. What is interesting to note is that only one of these follicles develop to full maturity in every cycle. So in this complete cycle of 28 days, there is a single mature follicle that develops. The mature follicle is known as the Grafting follicle, as I've indicated. The Grafting follicle secretes estrogen as it develops. So this Grafting follicle also releases a hormone called estrogen as it develops. The hormone is responsible for the secondary female characteristics. So in terms of at puberty, the characteristics that we associate with puberty are a result of the hormone called estrogen. And that estrogen is released from the structure called the Grafting follicle, as well as the development of the endometrium. So now we're seeing the association between the ovary and the lining of the uterus. Okay. In our next slide, we can focus on further developments at puberty. The Grafting follicle moves to the surface and the walls of the ovary rupture. When that process occurs, we say that ovulation has taken place, and this is usually around day 14. Okay, and this is based on the day when menstruation has started. So when a female starts her menstrual flow, that is regarded as day 1. So the 14th day after that would be seen as the day when ovulation is most likely to occur. The process of ovulation is stimulated by a hormone called LH. So the pituitary gland releases a hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH, and that targets the mature follicle, which is secreted so that the follicle ruptures and releases an egg. At puberty, we see that after ovulation, the Grafting follicle then develops under the influence of the hormone LH, and it now becomes a mass of cells known as the corpus luteum, as I've indicated here. So after the process of ovulation, the Grafting follicle forms the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum has a significantly important function as it secretes a hormone called progesterone. And the progesterone plays an important role in maintaining the lining of the endometrium in anticipation of implantation of a sperm. And we will look at that in our next slide. If the released secondary oocyte is not fertilized, then we'll see that the corpus luteum degenerates. So in this image, we can see that there's degeneration of the corpus luteum, and that degenerated follicle is an indication that fertilization has not taken place. However, if fertilization does occur, we will see that the corpus luteum continues its function until the end of the 12th week. So we would see that the corpus luteum maintains its structure for the next 12 weeks, because the corpus luteum is responsible for the production of progesterone, and that will maintain the lining of the endometrium. So when we look at the overview of this, so we've spent some time looking at the development within the ovary. As I mentioned, we started with the process of ovulation. We see that during ovulation, the egg or the oocyte was released, and we refer to that as the ovulatory phase. We now see that during the luteal phase, which is when the corpus luteum remains intact, it will release a hormone called progesterone, and that progesterone helps to thicken the endometrial lining. And here we clearly see the thickening of the endometrium. And we mentioned that if that corpus luteum is not fertilized, it will lead to a process where the lining is released, and we refer to that as the menstrual phase, where the lining of the endometrium is released. And that occurs due to the corpus luteum degenerating and a decrease in the level of progesterone. So the reason why the menstrual phase occurs is because fertilization has not occurred, and that means that the level of progesterone decreases. When that level of progesterone decreases, it results in the lining of the endometrium being released. And so we refer to that as menstruation, as you would see here. If we look at the next phase, the follicular phase, this again goes back to the development of a new follicle within the ovary. Now, let's look at the process of the uterine cycle. So we've mentioned that the endometrium of the uterus is rich in glands and blood vessels. So we say that it is highly vascular because it contains lots of blood vessels, and rich in glands that produce secretions. So from puberty to menopause, that's a period in the female reproductive system, their lifespan where they stop producing eggs. We find that the endometrium undergoes a monthly cyclic change, and this is known as the uterine cycle. So the events that occur on a cyclic basis in the uterus are referred to the uterine cycle. After ovulation, the uterus must be ready for implantation and the nutrition of a fertilized ovum. So let's try and understand that. So the female hormones, which are known as estrogen and progesterone, are responsible for thickening of the endometrium. So when we looked at the structure of the ovary, we saw that the primary follicle develops and releases and is released. This structure, called the corpus luteum, the Grafting follicle, stimulates the release of estrogen. So the Grafting follicle releases estrogen, and the estrogen is responsible for preparing the lining of the endometrium. Let's understand what happens. If fertilization does not occur, we know that the thickened and the vascularized tissue from the endometrium is not needed for implantation, simply because there is no egg ready for implantation. What happens then is that the upper layers of the endometrium membrane break down and are released with the unfertilized egg, or sometimes the immature egg, and leaves the body via the cervix and the vagina. This process is called menstruation. So as you would see here in this image, we see the process of menstruation occurring, and that's because the egg has reached the uterine chamber where no fertilization has taken place. The corpus luteum within the ovaries degenerate, and the level of progesterone decreases. And when the level of progesterone decrease, you find that the lining of the vascular membrane in the endometrium releases and it's discharged out of the body. And that process is called menstruation. Menstruation can last between 4 to 6 days. And this is essentially immediately after the progesterone levels decrease. So the endometrium in the uterus immediately starts to thicken once to prepare for the arrival of the next fertilized ovum. So we find that the next cycle begins. Some females may experience pain during menstruation, while others have little to no side effects or discomfort. So you would see that towards the end of the menstrual cycle, we find that a new cycle referring to the events in the ovary occur. So the follicular phase, where, as we discussed earlier on, we find that the primary follicle then develops, and we get on to the next cycle where after 14 days we find ovulation taking place. We then look at the next cycle of events, which is at the end of that next 28 days cycle, we find the beginning of menstruation, which marks the beginning of a new follicular phase. Well guys, you've done well. We've looked at some detailed concepts. Let's take a little break, freshen up, and we hope to see you back so that we can do a bit more planning and understanding around these content.